We're at the Jam Factory, a cafe in Oxford, and I'm with Helena Kazan.
Hi.
Hi. Helen, thank you for joining us at GRN for this interview. And so you're currently a lecturer at Oxford Brookes University and at the Royal College of Art, London.
Yes.
And you're also a research fellow in forensic architecture at Goldsmiths University.
Yeah,
right?
I was, yeah.
Right. And so you wear many hats as a writer, a curator, an artist. And so could you just tell us a little bit about your latest work right now on Lebanon?
Yeah. So I guess the most recent project that I kind of completed in Lebanon was an exhibition that I curated called Points of Contact.
Okay.
It came following 3-4 years of research that I'd been doing as a PhD candidate. Practice-based PhD candidate, so I'd been doing a lot of research. I'd been engaging with lots of other academics and practitioners and artists in Lebanon. So basically got into a conversation one of the times that I went for field work and with director of the Goethe Institute, and she basically offered a kind of a solo exhibition, but I was like, no, I don't want to do a solo exhibition. I want to do a project that includes all the different voices that have influenced my work, and part of it was just kind of an initial idea, feeling like it was really important to bring lots of people together into this space. So yeah, that's what it was. It curated an exhibition and a public program that brought like artists, architects, curators and lawyers and
what was
activists.
The theme of the exhibition?
Yeah, it was quite broad in a way because I wanted it to allow a lot of space for lots of different voices to come in. But it was, broadly speaking, I was thinking about violence and how it is materialised through the architecture of the built environment and how that relates to a certain kind of thinking around law.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, but also thinking about feminism in the midst of that and the body and testimony.
So I think much of your work kind of revolves around international law, architecture, and the human experience of violence, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And so I just wanted to know, how do you use, art installations and architecture in your work? Like, how do you use these kinds of tools for research and for presentation?
Yeah. I guess it's a methodology that has really developed over a long period of time. It started initially, particularly around the subject, thinking, there'd been a certain experience that I'd had as a child living through conflict in Lebanon. And a lot of my work, even before it was kind of critical or thinking about theory, was building these large-scale sculpture installations that was all about the impact of space on the body, phenomenology. And then I read this book by Al Weissman, who's an architect, on the architecture of Palestine and Israel. And I found in that book a way of speaking about space that I had experienced it. And so it kind of ignited something in a way. And from that, I kind of joined this kind of world of academia. And it was kind of from that point that these things started to mesh with each other, right? So I started my PhD or the Masters at the Centre for Research Architecture, in research-based practice, and through that found a space to allow the artistic practice that I'd kind of developed already to engage with this idea of architecture as a kind of mode of governance. But it was through that trajectory that I came to understand that although like architecture was this medium, like material medium, I was really talking about international law, but it took a long time to get there. Yeah.
It's very interesting how you're connecting both violence and conflict in a certain area along with the human experience of it, but you're also like talking about how the architecture of the place sort of develops that or like impacts that human experience, right?
It impacts the human experience, but it also becomes a material register of that. And I think that was really the few things that kind of percolated alongside one another, because alongside reading this book, I also kind of found a couple of archive images that were kind of stashed away in my parents' cupboard, and they were kind of each photograph, the 5 photographs, and each was like of a room in our house in Beirut, outside of Beirut. And each photograph was taken, I think, as my father kind of went on to say, that it was like a keepsake of that house. So there were like each photograph was of an empty room.
Okay.
And you know, he had like a few photographs left in this kind of Kodak Instamatic camera, so he just used them up by going around and photographing each room in the house.
Right.
In the premise and in the kind of in thinking about like how we would soon be forced to leave, right? And particularly one photograph I became very interested by, or obsessed by, you might say, because I worked on it for about 5 years after that, was one photograph which was of our kitchen. And it was 9 o'clock in the morning as we'd come up from the basement after staying there overnight to hide from the bombing, and the sun was streaming in from the south, like through the south-facing window, and on the window had been put masking tape to stop glass shattering during bombing.
Right.
And this photograph was taken at this point, and so this masking tape is this very small material register of the exterior threat that has been put there by that human, right, that feels that threat.
Okay.
So you look at the photograph, it's like this very classic almost 70s beige and brown kitchen that you might see anywhere at that time, and you know, the only register of what's the external threat that's taking place is this masking tape that's put there, which is basically a demarcation of exterior threat, and really isn't going to be able to protect you from the kind of worst case scenario, essentially. So it was in finding that image, in really kind of becoming very obsessed with it and looking at it and taking it into pieces and mining it, and I started to understand what it meant to have these material registers of an exterior threat, like human registers, but then how that is also part of an external force that's producing that too, right?
Oh, right. So basically, your family fled Lebanon when you were 7.
Yeah.
I read that in your paper, and so just how much did your own muscle memory like play a role in you being interested in these set of topics? And
yeah, I mean, I think it's had quite you know, consciously or unconsciously, it's had quite a lot of impact or influence, and it's interesting because like however far away you get from that history or those events, you can't remove the muscle memory, and I think that was something that I started to understand, like in a lot of the kind of more artistic sculptural work that I was doing. I was trying to engage a certain relationship of the body to architecture, and now I use it as a kind of space of situated knowledge, to really just to talk about something in a certain way with a certain kind of nuance, and to try and engage that in others or engage that in the viewer. So I've used that predominantly in the kind of performance lectures that I've been doing, where, let's say, I use audio-visual material to produce a kind of split second of tension in a space that engages the audience with that similar feeling of anxiety perhaps that you might get, but it also subsides very quickly, and it's not, you know, real, so it's not too extreme, but it just creates that moment where the audience can engage with what I'm saying, as a condition, as a bodily condition.
And what kind of impact do you think this kind of work has, you know, this kind of methodology and speaking about these sets of themes in this type of methodology? Like, does it have like a greater reach to an audience? Are they able to really feel what you're doing? And
I mean, certainly it's come through tried and tested, it's a tried and tested kind of like ways of doing it. Basically, I would present or try and like present work within an academic context, talking about a certain condition, and it would the questions or the conversation that would follow I could sense would become a bit frustrating for me, because I could sense the audience wasn't engaged with what I was talking about. I think it's difficult when you haven't experienced something to really be able to engage with it in a certain way, even just to be empathetic, let alone to really engage with it through any kind of nuanced thinking. So it became a mechanism to really be able to get past that initial 15-20 minutes of having to just like respond to kind of a series of questions that would try and bring people into the same space with me. It's a very good mechanism to bring in everyone straight away, and that's what I found. It's, you know, in a lot of the performance lectures I will do it the first 5 minutes, and it kind of starts off being a very normative like kind of lecture, and then very quickly slips into this kind of other experience, then comes back out again, and I find that's probably the most successful way to bring an audience that hasn't experienced something into that space of experience.
Okay, right.
So yeah, I mean, in my experience, it's had been able to have a much wider impact on audiences in trying to talk about this kind of thing. Yeah.
Alright. And what do you think could be? Now, you study definitely about the structures that are in place when the structures and the interaction of individuals with these structures, like in terms of the architecture and kind of governance technologies that come in through this kind of architecture. And also, but there's also, there's always this tussle between structure and agency, and like, how much, but in a situation of conflict, how much is, structure imposed on individuals, and like, is there a lack of agency in such cases?
I mean, I can talk specifically from the context of Lebanon and say that there is like there's no agency for like the kind of to be able to speak out or to be able to control or to be able to stop. Yeah. And I would say that the revolution that you're seeing at the moment is a kind of collective response to a long history of such structural violence that people are kind of finally trying to speak out about and still finding it very, very difficult and challenging. So yeah, I mean, I know that like I did my it's different in different contexts, and international law does operate slightly different ways in different contexts. But I think when you're looking at issues around aerial bombardment in international law specifically, and particularly in the context of Lebanon, partly because of the way that the civil war came to an end, the agreement that brought the civil war to an end in a way embedded a kind of structure that has removed kind of a lot of agency. It's a space of kind of real where the condition is really exaggerated to a certain degree.
Which is why it's all the more important. I mean, your work is kind of all the more important because you're studying the slow structural violence that's, percolating through architecture.
Yeah, right. Well, it's made visible through architecture. Architecture is very useful in that it's a material kind of response or a register, right, from both these forces, the interplay of both these forces, and it's at a distance slightly, so you're not needing to see, let's say, the kind of the human effect of it to a certain degree, but it's my work has continued on to looking at what are the ways that people are speaking out or have made work about that experience, and how can we recognise that within the frame of international law.
So Helena, your work is very interdisciplinary in nature. So could you tell us where do you see yourself sitting in your field?
Good question. I guess in a way I've always seen myself as a spatial practitioner, though it gets a bit disrupted by the field of architecture that sees itself as a separate field. But no, I'm just joking. But the idea, I came from a visual arts background, but also always worked in thinking about space and the politics of space. Okay. But it's just through the inquiry that I began through the Masters and the PhD, now find myself within the space of thinking about international law and jurisprudence, essentially. So I'm becoming more and more engaged with these different discourses around feminist critical legal theory and what could be a feminist intervention in international law, right?
Right. Could you tell us a bit about your educational background, like to be an interdisciplinary practitioner, spatial practitioner? What were the various degrees that you did, or like what were the courses that you took?
Okay, so I started off as doing my BA in fine art painting, which is quite funny to think about now because I haven't picked up a paintbrush since I was very young. And within the frame of the BA program, started really thinking about space and architecture, and it gave me that room, and I produced this large scale installation for my degree show that drove all of my lecturers crazy, but was the first time they did installation in such a scale. Then from it's funny, I remember that because I just taught class and thinking about like BA shows anyway. So and then from that point, because I was really interested in architecture, I thought I would go on to do an architecture degree. Right. So I went to work in an architectural practice, and quickly realised I didn't want to be an architect, but I was really interested in space. Okay. But continued to use that as a framework to think about the work that I was doing. So my first full-time job was as a curator after my BA. And so I was working across these two spaces of like space through curation and then my own practice, curating my own projects alongside, also working with lots of other people, curating different kind of shows. So that's, I think, how the interdisciplinary nature of the work really became embedded.
Right.
Just the kind of interest in architecture and space, and then working with architects within the frame of like curating exhibitions really started that thinking. And then, as I said, when I read this book by Ayal, it became like a bit more concretized, basically because I found myself in a department that was super interdisciplinary,
Right.
the Centre for Research Architecture. It took me 2 to 3 years to apply because I thought I had to be an architect to be in this space.
Oh,
I was
okay.
I was a bit worried, but then found myself embedded in a kind of really great set of peers that were from architecture and human rights law and curating, and so it's great.
So how did you develop your interest in conflict specifically?
I mean, I think it was just embedded particularly through this experience as a child and trying to understand why we had been forced to go through such an experience. I just was really always sat with me that I just couldn't quite understand how that had happened and why people were being forced to live in this condition for such a long time, because we left right at the end of the Civil War, so we lived there for a few years throughout, and it really fluctuated. There was times that I went to school and everything was
And on which period was this, like?
So we left in 1989.
Okay.
So just before, literally just a few months before, but it was when our community were particularly being targeted. So I think it just always sat with me. I was trying to understand how people are forced to live through that condition, and so I think the whole thing has come from that question as a child, trying to understand that, and how that lived experience is articulated through architecture, and how that speaks of larger power structures, particularly looking at the law.
My last question is that how do you see how this lived experience is articulated through architecture and how that plays a role in these larger power structures, as you just said, through law? Like, how do you see this kind of work, this interdisciplinary work, mixed methods and all of that, how do you see it impacting, say, policy now?
Yeah, I mean, so I think the work has led me to, in kind of the focus study on going back to Lebanon. Obviously I've been away for a while. I went back and realised that the mode of practice that I had developed to engage an audience and to articulate a certain experience was also similar to other people that had experienced those similar things in Lebanon itself. Lebanon is very well known for having an incredibly strong artistic community, and very successfully so. Like they're artists that have gone all over the world, particularly after the Civil War period. And there was a particular moment when I had produced a kind of an installation. It was a kind of an experiment where I was trying to test this shelter that was produced during the was engineered during the Second World War for British people to use, called the Morrison Shelter. And I had reenacted an experiment that the British Ministry of Home Security had produced, and in that experiment, this shelter gets destroyed. So I just reenacted this experiment as part of a commission, and watched this table being destroyed. And I go to Lebanon, and I watch a very similar reenactment or production of a certain image of destroying a bed by an artist called Rabbi Marua. And I could see something that what I come to term as poetic testimony.
Right.
And so, the case of Lebanon is a very clear example of that, where kind of an exclusion from the law has forced the experience of it to be found within the space of arts and culture production. I mean, it has very forcibly been excluded through the end of the Civil War agreement. And then through that also kind of the way that certain testimony is seen as fallible, human testimony is seen as fallible, and looking at the kind of forms of expression that need to perhaps take on poetic means, right? And to kind of reconstitute the notion of poetics as this thing that's in excess of the stated facts, right? And to kind of move away from that more gendered thinking or negative thinking around it, right? So I've been taking that and really thinking about that in relation to how we can recognise different forms of poetic testimony as a way...
How that used as evidence.
Exactly. How can poetic testimony enter the space of the law as a way of engaging further agency in the human experience of violence, right? And to think about that across different communities that have experienced violence as kind of spectacular but also structural and slow, which is also something that is a really important question when we talk about environmental injustice.
Right.
And it's also something that I kind of was thinking about alongside of some of the work that I was doing in Alaska with a community on an island called Helene that had similarly been excluded from the conversation around their own future because of the form of knowledge that they were producing around it. So I started to understand how these things were kind of tangible across different communities. So I have been working in New York in trying to engage this kind of very context-specific conversation and thinking within the frame of Lebanon to larger international communities and thinking about how different communities come together and thinking about how these forms of knowledge can be upheld alongside more forensic forms of knowledge production to produce more agency for the human that's experiencing this.
So in some way, this poetic testimony can be seen as a way of like giving voice or like amplifying the voices of marginalized communities.
I mean, I wouldn't say like giving, because I think it's there. It's to see that knowledge, recognize that knowledge for what it is, and to uphold it alongside the other forms of knowledge that are being produced, so that one doesn't exclude the other, which quite often happens. You have this idea of subjectivity and objectivity, and they become this oil and water situation. And it's to think about how these things can become more embedded or uphold each other in more important ways, more specific ways. And so, I'm not a lawyer or an international lawyer, but and I would love to somehow... There are examples of how this is starting to happen in different places, Canada and different communities. Like, there is different examples of it, but I think there could be wider recognition, there could be more work that takes place that could affect the way that international law recognises the forms of knowledge that are coming into the spaces of law.
All right. Thank you so much, Helena, for joining us.
Thank you
really
for the
great chatting with you.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you.